Thank you. I'm delighted to be here in Ottawa, and I'm humbled to be asked to give a talk named for Chet Mitchell, and I'm very grateful to everyone who made this talk possible. It's been a while since I've given a talk outside the United States, and I guess my understanding is the basic game plan for a post-2016 talk overseas is we spend the first half of the talk apologizing and the second half crying. I'm going to do my best not to seek asylum during the talk. I understand that today is the day that cannabis is legalized in Canada, so maybe I'll repeat what the flight attendant said as we landed, which is, I know you have many choices, and I appreciate that you've chosen to spend this time here. I know afterwards we have a reception, and I guess I'll try the brownies if you do. My work generally concerns the history of the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and the U.S.'s transition from slavery to freedom to racialized segregation, to Jim Crow. And initially, my work on the project that became Thunder in the Mountains, my research on the Nez Perce War of 1877, was a way for me to explore the decades after Reconstruction. And this period is a crucial moment for the United States. It's when the foundation was laid for battles that we are very much still fighting over the contours of liberty and equality, over the relationship between race and citizenship, and over the proper size, scope, and role of government. So let's think about it. In 1865, the United States, at least east of the Mississippi River, was a beacon of liberty and equality to the world. So the nation had fought a war to abolish slavery, and the government was devoting itself to turning millions of people who had been held as slaves into citizens. Congress created a new agency, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, to redistribute confiscated rebel land and help freed people get paying jobs. The Bureau built schools and hospitals and orphanages and asylums, entire court systems. And this was really the first big federal social welfare agency in U.S. history. And typical of that period, this is an 1869 Thomas Nast cartoon, Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner, the peoples of the world, all at the same table, all eating from the same turkey. Everyone gets a piece, come one, come all, free and equal. So 1865. But by 1900, the U.S. was following a very different path. Instead of working to integrate all people into the body politic, at least in theory, the entire purpose of government had shifted. So much of the policy-making energy that had been devoted to making the nation free and equal was now devoted to a vast project of sifting and sorting. So in 1900, segregation and disenfranchisement was certainly the rule of the South, really the rule of much of the rest of the country. And every 2 or 3 days, an African American was lynched. And this epidemic of lynching extends decade after decade after decade. 1900, Chinese immigrants, for all intents and purposes, were banned from the U.S. Places like Ellis Island were less places of entry than places of exclusion, right? Places that guarded and secured and maintained the integrity, often explicitly defined as the racial purity of our borders. 1900, the U.S. was an imperial power with territories that stretched from San Juan to Manila. A person with dark skin was as likely to be a colonial subject as a citizen. So from 1865 to 1900, from emancipation to empire, this is a stunning turn in our sense of the U.S. and the purpose of its government. The story of this turn goes through the West, right, where the last decades of the 19th century, it was the site of a massive exercise of government power to take land and wealth from one group of people and give it to another. And the redistribution was justified with the logic of white supremacy. The Nez Perce War of 1877 allows us to consider the broad pivot that the U.S. was making in the years after Reconstruction. And in my book, what I wanted to do was show how real people saw and experienced these epochal transformations. And in particular, I focus on two what I would say is important, relatively underappreciated figures in late 19th century America. An Army general named Oliver Otis Howard and a Native American leader named Joseph. He was the leader of a small band of Nimipu or Nez Perce Indians in far northeastern Oregon. And I'll talk tonight a little bit about Oliver Otis Howard, and then I'll talk a little bit about Joseph and what their conflict teaches us about Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction moment, and maybe I'll sort of gesture a little to our current moment. So, who was Oliver Otis Howard? He was a Maine Yankee. He was a West Point graduate. You can see he sported quite a beard. One of the challenges of writing this book was, very quickly I ran out of synonyms for bushy. Rippling. At a certain point, you could deploy matted. I could never, rabbinic never felt right. And a turning point in his life occurred in 1857 when God started speaking to him. He was 26 years old. He was lonely and depressed, battling clouds of flies and mosquitoes in the worst, most remote U.S. Army posting imaginable, Tampa, Florida. Howard described Tampa, he called it a field for self-denial, which I think is a civic slogan ripe for readoption. Welcome to Tampa, a field for self-denial. And right as the Civil War broke out, Howard was contemplating resigning from the Army and going to seminary. He was planning to pursue the ministry, but the secession of the southern states, it essentially opened a new path to him. And he stayed and he fought in the Army from the Battle of Bull Run, very, very early battle in the war, onward. So in June 1862, he lost his arm in battle, makes reading his letters quite a challenge. But he was someone who took very little time to recover. By August, he was back on the front lines, and he ended the war as one of William Tecumseh Sherman's commanders during the March to the Sea and then the final campaign through the Carolinas, fighting for the Union was, he viewed it as his way to serve God, to make God's kingdom real on earth. And as the Civil War was ending, President Lincoln tapped Howard to head the Freedmen's Bureau. Right? This new experiment in what the government could and should do for its people. And at root, the agency's task, Howard's mission, was to give concrete meaning to liberty and equality. Right? Liberty and equality, these are values that were boldly pronounced in the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, but they were never precisely defined. Right? The historian Leon Litwack once described the central question of the post-Civil War moment as how free is free? And the Bureau's role, Howard's role, was undeniably crucial to answering that question. Now, histories of Reconstruction, as a general matter, they've cast Howard as a flawed hero. In many ways, he embodied the limitations of the federal government's efforts to remake the rebel South. Historian William McFeely gave Howard the ominous epithet, the Yankee stepfather. And at the same time, I think it's fair to say that he was a true champion of African American civil rights. During the Civil War, he was constantly meeting men and women who had crossed U.S. Army lines searching for freedom. And every encounter convinced him all the more of the fundamental equality that existed across races. So after the war, he integrated his church in Washington. He channeled a tremendous amount of Bureau resources into education. You know, there were plenty of devoted abolitionists who were quite racist, right? And sliced and diced equality into a political equality as opposed to social equality. Howard pretty consistently retained a very unitary sense of equality. And when a group of influential evangelicals gathered in late 1866 to discuss opening a theological school to train black preachers in Washington, D.C., Howard said, you have to think bigger. It has to be a full university with a medical school, a law school, teachers' college. And by the time it was chartered in March 1867, there was no controversy over the fact that it was going to be named for Howard, right? Howard University. He actually told the people who were responsible for chartering it that it shouldn't be named for him, and they said to him, you can pretend that it's named after someone else named Howard, but we're naming it Howard. Now, Howard thought initially that the Civil War was this path open to him by God, and then when he was tapped to head the Freedmen's Bureau, he was 34 years old. Like many people at the end of the war, that was wondering if his best days were behind him. And then this enormous job was thrust upon him, and he really thought that his role in Reconstruction was God's providence. He was convinced that this would be the cause of his life. And he thought this was why he had been put on earth, right? This was what he had been meant to do. And then it all fell apart. Reconstruction collapsed. The Bureau's mission was relatively quickly compressed and snuffed out. And by the 1870s, the politics of the nation had fundamentally shifted. Howard was personally humiliated in the process. He became just a lightning rod for everyone hostile to the basic enterprise of Reconstruction. The Bureau lost credibility in public opinion, and he nearly went broke defending himself from corruption charges. So here's, this is a picture of Howard during the Civil War, and this is a picture of Howard shortly after Reconstruction. And when I first saw this picture, I thought, oh my God, Reconstruction aged him. And then, I thought, the first picture, he was in his early 30s. Here's a picture where he's in his mid to late 40s. Then I looked at a picture of myself in my early 30s. Now I'm in my mid to late 40s. And so I'm less convinced by just the physical aging due to Reconstruction. But what do you do? I guess Howard's story, raises kind of a basic question. What do you do when your life's work, right, the thing that gave everything leading up to it meaning, is destroyed? Howard went searching for redemption, and he thought he could find it not by leaving government and protesting what it was becoming, but by staying and serving. It's kind of a dilemma that is facing lots of people in Washington, D.C. Over these past years. And after being exonerated by one last investigation, he was able to rejoin the active duty military in the summer of 1874. He was given command of the U.S. Army's Department of the Columbia, named for the Columbia River. So it was responsible for Oregon and Washington Territory, Idaho Territory, and Alaska. So it's pretty vast territory. It was based, headquarters based in Portland, Oregon, a bustling town of 8,000. And it seemed to him that this was a merciful exile, right? It was an opportunity to go basically as far away as you could get from Washington, D.C., and still be in the continental United States. This would just be a clean break from his life in the capital. And he saw his time in the West as his great second chance. And he may have struggled to make sense of the new American order, but he was, in certain ways, this was very comforting to be back in the Army. He was back working for William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the commanding general of the Army at that point, and President Grant again. And he was just determined to succeed in this new America. And what did Howard do out west? A big part of his work involved forcing Native Americans onto reservations. In a way, reservation policies enacted a fantasy of Reconstruction. Howard had been frustrated in his attempts to redistribute confiscated rebel land and create a yeomanry of African American small freeholders, but he had a seemingly limitless amount of 20-acre plots, right, that he could give to Native Americans, and he was able to think that he could connect them to all kinds of social services, also very similar to the kinds of services that he had been trying to connect African Americans to. And he thought that his work could be done peacefully, and he actually thought, as someone who was the grandchild of the Revolutionary War generation, he grew up knowing people in Maine who had known Indians, and their view was that genocide and extermination was the only path for the U.S. And in his view, he thought an assimilationist policy, a policy that believed that Native peoples could become citizens, he believed that this was the height of humanity. Now, His work with Native Americans in his first years in the Department of the Columbia, he found it very affirming, very happy. He wrote to his daughter and said, "My work here is easy." But that sense ran out in the summer of 1877. And that's when Howard led a military campaign against a group of Nimipu families, Nez Perce families, who refused to leave their ancestral territories in the Wallowa Valley, right at the far northeast corner of Oregon, and then across the Snake River and Salmon River valleys into Idaho. And about 700 to 900 or so men, women, and children wound up fleeing through Idaho and Montana and along the long, ragged border between Idaho and Montana that marks the Continental Divide. They went across Wyoming, actually across the newly created Yellowstone National Park, where they took some of the first tourists there hostage. And then they cut north through Montana territory, through the Buffalo Plains of Montana, trying to cross the Medicine Line, trying to reach Sitting Bull. And for nearly 4 months, for more than 1,200 or so miles, over some of the roughest terrain in the country, the Nez Perces outran Howard, outran his troops. But in early October 1877, soldiers trapped the Nez Perce families just one day shy of the border. And they were starving, they were freezing, they had been devastated by months of vicious battles, and their surviving leader was Chief Joseph. Now, the title of my book, Thunder in the Mountains, comes from Chief Joseph. His Nimipu name, Hein Mat Tuyalakekt, is translated as thunder rolling in the mountains or thunder rising to ever loftier heights. And as much as this book is about Howard, it couldn't not be about Joseph. I mean, it's one thing to ask who is Howard. I think it's a more difficult question to ask who is Chief Joseph. Over the course of decades, really from the moment the war ended, myth has just been larded upon him. And it's hard to find the real man. I tried to find every moment where he was recorded as speaking. But all of his speech is filtered through interpreters. Very different kinds of interpreters, so there are ways you can kind of map his speech from one to another and sort of see what continuity there is from interpreter to interpreter. And he was someone whom Howard had met and negotiated with before the war. He had emerged as a Nez Perce spokesman in the early 1870s when he was a young man in his early 30s, someone who was outranked by many other leaders who had long experience hunting buffalo, fighting rival tribes to the east of the Bitterroot Mountains, Blackfeet, Lakota, Crow. But Joseph made an immediate impression on Howard and on many other officials. So trying to think about why, I think for one thing, he was tall. I know that sounds shallow. I guess when I watch political debates, often it just boils down to who's taller, right? And he certainly towered, over 6 feet, towered over Oliver Otis Howard, who sort of occupies more my altitude. And he was also handsome and in person had a charisma, where people who met him, who negotiated with him, described mesmerizing encounters. As someone who didn't just shake a hand, he would clutch a hand and hold it. He'd gaze deep into people's eyes, and you could think of it as a practice that showed strength and immense confidence, but also projected a certain irresistible vulnerability. So when Howard first met him in the spring of 1875, he wrote that Joseph had looked into his soul while revealing his own motives in turn. So Joseph inspired a lot of trust, and then also just this flood of romantic projections, even from people who profess to doubt the very humanity of Native peoples. So Joseph would meet Howard several times to argue that his band should be allowed to keep their ancestral land. Leaders of other Nez Perce bands, there are a lot of sort of far-flung autonomous bands. Leadership was very diffuse and egalitarian. But leaders of other bands had signed a treaty in 1863 that ceded the Wallowa Valley, Joseph's summer land. But Joseph's band hadn't been represented at all in the 1863 Treaty Council. And Joseph, he engaged a language of universal liberty and equality in his attempt to preserve his people's place in this changing world where settlers are pouring in. And he, of course, invokes a language of sovereignty. But what you find over time is that actually relatively quickly, his words sort of blur into a language of rights. We only ask to an even chance to live as other men live, Joseph famously said. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. It's a statement of what it means to be a free and equal individual. It's something that, certainly in the U.S., if you were to ask people, what it means to be a citizen, what rights they could expect, I think it tracks, pretty closely our modern sense of it. And certainly, Howard would have immediately recognized Joseph's ideas and rhetoric, his vision for what it means to be, in essence, a citizen. Joseph was engaging many of the same ideas, many of the same values that Howard had pioneered as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, where did Joseph's arguments, where did his language come from? Right? He is in a place where, it wasn't like he was following the developments of abolition and union and Reconstruction. And, I think, for one thing, I could see there was a very strong, long-standing legal consciousness relating to treaty rights, right? And you see this, before the 1863 treaty, there was a wave of treaty making that included the Nimipu people in 1855, and the reports of the Indian agents to the officials in Washington year after year. You see this again and again, where they comment on, this number of people have adopted Western dress, this number of people have fenced in plots and are farming. But then there's often you find comment that, geez, they know their treaty backwards and forwards, right? They can talk to you about it all day. And so part of it is about a sense of treaty rights and you could say sovereignty, you could say, comity as a, C-O-M-I-T-Y as a nation. And then I think a lot of it also has to do with Joseph's band's practice over decades of very successful commerce with settlers. Decades of bargaining, building enormous herds of cattle and horses, bargaining as equals, and even more than that, bargaining from a position of serious wealth. And it was wealth that Howard and many others just couldn't quite see. Although the settlers themselves who did the trading often knew that the Nez Perce women carried gold with them, carried large rolls of greenbacks, right? And many lucrative deals could be made with them. Now, by the time that Joseph first met Howard, he was a seasoned advocate. So when ranchers started encroaching on Nez Perce lands in the Wallowa Valley in the spring of 1872, they told Joseph rightly that the valley had been put into the public domain, that the General Land Office had surveyed it and divided it up into homesteads. And that presented Joseph with a real challenge, right? We could have looked at those facts and just thought, this is the end of the story, right? He had to figure out how to move the federal government, how to find and connect with American power, how to change official policy, and all this from incredibly isolated mountain valley 2,500 miles away from Washington, D.C. So isolated. Even today, driving into the Wallowa Valley is just, a pure white knuckle experience on the road. Just mile after mile of switchbacks, and then you come to a straightaway, you think you're home free, and then you see a sign saying switchbacks next 8 miles, right? And the settlers, when they first moved in, they had their wagons, right? We can picture, Oregon pioneers. And then they reached hills that were so steep that they had to disassemble the wagons, for lack of a better word, schlep them up the mountain, right? And then reassemble them, cut down a tree to use as an anchor, and then roll their way in. So incredibly isolated mountain valley, so far away from the center of power. And what's more than that, he didn't do his talking in English. He didn't speak English, right? He spoke Nez Perce, and he did his talking in a regional trade language called Chinook jargon, right? And he was trying to reach a federal government that, in essence, its purpose was to divest Native Americans of millions of acres of property. Its purpose was not to restore acreage to them under any circumstances. So what did he do? Joseph essentially decided to plead his case to any federal official he could possibly find. So he went to the local Indian agent. He found a regional supervisor for Indian affairs. He pinned down a congressman from one valley over who happened to be home on a recess. And every one of them told him the same thing. They said, what you say sounds very persuasive, that you weren't represented at the Treaty Council, the title wasn't properly taken away from you. but what do you expect me to do? I'm just one guy. In case you haven't noticed, we're 2,500 miles away from Washington. And they just told him there was nothing they could do. But what's amazing is that almost immediately, Joseph's efforts bore fruit. So Joseph starts his advocacy in early to mid 1872, and exactly a year later, summer of 1873, President Grant signed an executive order reserving a substantial portion of the Wallowa Valley for the roving Nez Perce bands. Getting land yanked from the public domain and given back to a tribe that was still maintaining tribal relations, right? Still traveling with the seasons, still nomadic. That was no small achievement. But the order resolved nothing. Oregon's governor, Oregon's congressional delegation, they vociferously protested. They appealed to the Department of the Interior, and ultimately, that led the machinery of government to shift into reverse. And 2 years later, 1875, President Grant signed an second executive order reopening the valley up for settlement. So I think here's where it gets interesting, right? You'd think that an order from the president would be the end of story, right? He made a decision, President Grant, and then he changed his mind. What can you do? It's over. But Joseph refused to see the second executive order as resolving his claims with any finality. From his perspective, if the first executive order didn't resolve anything, why would the second executive order? Right? And he kept pressing. And when the army was sent in at various moments to maintain some distance between between Joseph's band and the Wallowa Valley settlers, Joseph didn't view the army officers as leading a hostile occupying force. He saw them just as another set of bureaucrats with another line into Washington whom he could negotiate with. And so he kept pressing, and he convinced many of these army officers that the Nez Perces were the rightful owners of the valley. Now, these army officers were not bleeding hearts. One of them had actually made his reputation as a soldier in Northern California in the 1860s, essentially leading a genocide against the native peoples there, in the words of a sympathetic newspaper, or sympathetic to the extermination campaign, hunting Indians for sport. And he met with and negotiated with Joseph, and he reported back to Howard that he thought Joseph was right. And in a way, Joseph was intuiting how the American state worked, right? That it had many faces and many competing authorities. Power in America, power in the US, it was split, and it remained split in so many different ways, right? Among federal, state, and local governments, right? Among legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and among overlapping agencies that compete with each other all the time. The courts followed elaborate procedures. Joseph and his people were not regarded as American citizens, so they couldn't go into court. And the legislative process, there was a way for native nations to petition Congress. But legislative process also was similarly protracted, highly choreographed. And America after the Civil War, the US, was increasingly governed by administrators in the executive branch. And while the government was getting more adept at implementing policies, right? The technology of governing was improving. It could extend its reach even into the Wallowa Valley. Policymaking at the executive level, right? Devising the actual policies that the government then would be charged with implementing. This was wide open, right? There were far-flung bureaucrats who were invested with a tremendous amount of discretionary authority, and this created a fluid core of government power that almost begged its subjects to contest every decision, right? There was always someone else to turn to. And often it seemed that persistence in this process could be leveraged into rights. And Joseph saw this. And in a way, his great achievement is that he figured this out. But Oliver Otis Howard never understood this, even though he had lived through this kind of governing as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. He saw Chief Joseph not as someone who was participating in a new American process, but rather saw Joseph as someone who was showing disrespect for it, right? Saw Joseph as someone who could only be governed by brute force. Howard had a great deal of discretion in how he would work with Joseph's band and with a handful of other bands that were refusing to move onto the 1863 reservation. But Howard refused to take a conciliatory path. In May 1877, he gave the holdout bands 30 days to move with their large herds from Oregon to Idaho at a time when the Snake River and the Salmon River, both of which had to be crossed, were at flood stage. What does that mean? I don't know. What it means, to try and put that into perspective, the Snake River Valley, also known as Hell's Canyon, is deeper than the Grand Canyon, right? And it's a big river at flood stage. The way Howard eventually described these rivers, he described them as torrents with mountain shores, right? And this ultimatum all but sparked the war. And once hostilities began, Howard became single-minded as he pursued the Nez Perce families through the mountains. But military victory didn't mean redemption for Howard. And almost immediately he recognized this. So part of this has to do with the fact that it took him months and months to capture the Nez Perce families. And once that started to happen, settlers were constantly expressing their outrage, and there were enough newspapers that had always been hostile to Howard dating back to Reconstruction, and by that point then they start making puns on his initials. So he was O.O. Howard, Oliver Otis Howard. This cartoon is O.O. Howard, and sometimes he was known as Uh-Oh Howard. So the fact that he couldn't crush the Nez Perces immediately meant this was never going to be a redemptive task for him. And I think, though, more importantly, at the moment of Joseph's surrender, Howard had a very difficult realization. I think he realized that he was no longer the hero of his own story. So ultimately, Howard wound up playing a key role in making a place for Chief Joseph as a major dissenter in post-Reconstruction U.S. culture. Howard publicized Joseph's words, released his surrender statement to the press, and he discussed the chief at length in 3 books. It's like he just couldn't stop writing about Joseph. And largely because of Howard, Joseph's surrender statement, his statement in which he declared, "I will fight no more forever." It became one of the most recited speeches in American schools. And in the end, it was Chief Joseph and not General Howard who would become an inspiration to generations of civil rights activists. Now, Howard may have betrayed the old values of abolition and union and Reconstruction when he played his part in conquering the West and building the new regime. Here's a picture of the two of them. They had a reunion at the Carlisle Indian School, one of these assimilationist boarding schools where the headmaster of the school, Richard Henry Pratt, had declared that his goal was to kill the Indian and save the man. They met just months before Joseph's death in 1904. But in a way, if Howard betrayed his core values, Joseph recharged some of the old values of liberty and equality with a new power to speak to a new nation. Joseph's rhetoric is so poignant, right, so moving, that it's easy to overlook that he wasn't simply making a plea for a full bundle of rights as an American, right? What we might call citizenship. And he wasn't simply making a plea for sovereignty and nationhood either. I think more specifically, he was trying to define citizenship and sovereignty in an age of big government. Right? He had a set of ideas, he had a substantive message, but he also had a set of methods that I think we can learn from now more than ever. Joseph was claiming the right to participate in the contentious struggles that are baked into our modern way of governing. It was the right to speak to the state, and it was the right to be heard. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
I found this incredibly interesting. I was counsel for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, and I'm doing my PhD here now in this department. And two departments actually, but anyway, we won't go into that. So the thing that I find really interesting, there's so many things. I have two questions. One is, this was in an era of state building, which is, it is incredibly interesting that he understood, so far away, as you say, from the operations of power. He's not immersed in it. And he completely understood how machinery worked and how policy was being developed, et cetera, as you postulate. But this fluidity in this era of state building, he's asserting, as you say, an alternate notion in terms of indigenous assertions of justice vis-a-vis the state, right? He's trying to be part of that, an alternate state building process. Mm-hmm. Now we're in a situation where the state is solidified. We've gone through a period of solidification, and now, of course, there's globalization, and we're getting into this new era. This kind of sort of like, let's get away from having to mediate our claims through the state and just assert our way of being. So I'm just sort of curious about your commentary on where we are now vis-a-vis Chief Joseph's his advocacy, and then I have another question.
So that's a interesting and important question. It's something that actually I'm teaching our course on federal Indian law for the first time this semester. So I've been thinking a lot about tribal advocacy and the rise and fall and rebirth of tribal sovereignty in the U.S., modern tribal rights, and what I see, we're actually, in the U.S., it's a very tricky moment because really from 1968, 1970 till about 1986, with a couple of potholes along the way, there was this major revival of tribal self-government, right? And just the capacity to govern and the kind of rights that tribes could claim in court, and the kind of audience that tribes could expect from the administrative state. And over the last 30 years, we've seen the courts become a less congenial forum for rights claims. And now with the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh, I told you there will be tears. I think that there is a solid majority on the court that is very suspicious of tribal sovereignty, whether it's inherent tribal sovereignty, whether it's congressional action that seems to benefit tribes. There's a skepticism over whether that kind of legislation is really benefiting Native Americans as a political category, right, as opposed to as a racial category. Kavanaugh certainly, with respect to his writings about Native Hawaiians, you can see he sort of views sort of the whole field through a lens of racial preferences. So there are a lot of challenges. And then you have, after the Obama administration, which was very open to working closely with tribes, there's been a real turnabout from the Trump administration to the point that, just to give one example, land into trust policies, where there's a lot of money that has been devoted to consolidating tribal land holdings and even extending tribal land holdings, where the government funds land purchases and then admits it into sort of tribal ownership status, trust status. In a lot of places, the Trump administration has sort of halted those programs. And then actually in Massachusetts, there was an about-face where the Trump administration has declared that land that was taken into trust doesn't belong in trust, and so with the Mashpees in Massachusetts. And we certainly see with the Dakota Access Pipeline too, right? That one administration goes one way, the other administration goes in a much more hostile way, and it's very interesting to see the state of tribal advocacy and how nimble tribal advocacy is becoming. So one thing that we've seen in the last 50 years is that the capacity of tribes to have really high quality legal representation, right, and just aggressive counsel in courts, I mean, that's exponentially expanded. Right, there are, there's just a world of really good lawyers who are working for tribes. And at the same time, clearly that's not enough. And there is a lot of work, I think, being away from the courts that's being channeled into negotiations with the federal government and with state governments. And then I think Dakota Access Pipeline, I think, shows that there's a whole other world of, the fact that you lose at the administration, the fact that a court might not be friendly to you, is not the end of the story. It's only the beginning, right? And that there are other forums and other ways of leveraging claims.
Very much sort of follows on Christiane's question. I was just really interested in your aside as you went through about reservation policy in terms of agriculture, and of course I knew a little bit about that, but it was the equation of that with the Freedmen's Bureau, so 40 acres in a mule to 20 acres in a plough. And I had never sort of heard of it framed that way around in terms of sort of fitting into Jeffersonian landowning democracy.
Oh yeah, for me, we can think of Reconstruction as something that ended, but I don't think it ended for Howard. I think he was revisiting it and thinking about it, right, and sort of compensating for his failures and trying to sort of emerge on top again. And Grant's peace policy, which really was the 1870s reservation policy, and the assimilation policies that followed, so much of that is rooted in talk of enabling Native Americans to become citizens, right? And it's in a way, we have this sort of sad alpha and omega of Indian policy, where on one side it's exterminationist, and then the liberal side is assimilationist. We certainly see that still, in Supreme Court opinions. You can look at, Justice Ginsburg's federal Indian law decisions, and you see someone who is, very uncomfortable with a political category that is not subject to the same rights baseline as everyone else, right? But there is for many people who are pursuing assimilationist policies, they would say they recognize the humanity of Native Americans, their capacity for citizenship, and then it's just this really rigid view of what citizenship has to be. And in my book, in a way, post-Joseph, and I think through Joseph's dissent, you see that start to crack up a little bit, right? The idea that being a citizen means living as, being a Christian farmer, right? And in the book, one sort of strand that I follow to sort of move the story into the 20th century is the story of a lieutenant of Oliver Otis Howard's who lived this remarkable life where, born in 1852, in 1860 he sees Abraham Lincoln on his way to his first inauguration, and then at age 90 he's protesting the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. That's a life. And but for him, his big realization, he meets Joseph at the surrender, he spends 24 hours as Joseph's minder, and then he kind of washes out of the army after a few years, hangs out a shingle to practice law in Portland, Oregon, and over time becomes more and more radical. And by 1900, he's talking about the Nez Perce War, and he's talking about the Spanish-American War and the colonization of the Philippines. And at that point, he thinks, the U.S. is crushing people and feeling good about it through sort of legal, by relying on legal technicalities. And he thought, if we really believe in equality, then you have to have a right to go to hell if you want to. That's the way he put it. And it seems like there's and that's the moment where sort of you see the transition from what the political energy of abolition was into what the causes of and concerns of modern liberalism in the 20th century would be.
I guess I'm next. Do I have to speak into this?
You have to sing. You have to sing into that.
Well, very interesting, and I think resonance with sort of later issues, as you've discussed, and interesting resonance with the Canadian scene, although the Canadian scene plays out a bit differently. I have lots of questions. I'm going to buy the book. I think the way in which these narratives about Reconstruction and also the emergence of the administrative state, the way they are humanized through these two characters, Howard and Joseph, is really interesting. But I guess what I want to ask about is this shift that we see from resistance to working within the system. And I think legal scholars do tend to make this distinction between repressive interventions, criminal proceedings, policing, state violence through military interventions, and sort of the regulatory, civil proceedings, administrative action, so on and so forth. And this is a bit of a false dichotomy, of course, because for some matters, and certainly with indigenous issues, I think, the course operates around land title struggles, of course, around indigenous rights struggles, in dealing with sort of regulatory violations under the administrative Indian Acts, and so on and so forth. After all these legal processes, whether they're repressive or regulatory, presume the legitimate sovereignty of the colonizing state. So this shift that you described that Joseph made between resistance to working within the system and recognizing the many faces of the system, did he have a sort of a critical attitude towards that? Did he understand that he was shifting terrain from sort of a sovereignty struggle to a rights struggle within a sort of multiple facets of the state?
So that's a really great question. So Joseph was a teenager when the Treaty of 1855 was signed. And what he saw and what his father saw after the treaty was that, like in so many of these contexts, the treaty itself prompted just a flood of settlers coming in and then testing the bounds of the treaty and then washing away the treaty, right? And certainly in Nez Perce country, the fact that there is a treaty 8 years later that reduced the Nez Perce reservation, the 1855 boundaries, by 90%, right? This just follows a very old pattern. You can go back to the 18th century. There are treaties and then the next treaty, then the next treaty. And very soon after the 1855 treaty, and there are treaties all across the Northwest, there was just a massive amount of fighting. Nez Perces generally stayed out of it and were, really remained friendly with the United States during that time. But there were, nations, the Spokanes, who were, basically people were hanging from trees, right? There was just massive destruction of tribal life. And just before the Nez Perce War, so 1873, 74, there was the Modoc War, which was a war fought in the Oregon-California borderlands. And notable because at a peace council, the Modoc leaders actually ambushed the general in charge, and but in the aftermath of that, the Modocs were captured, its leaders were hanged, and they were exiled to Indian Territory. And so there was a very, an unmistakable sense of what war with the U.S. would mean. And what it would mean was total destruction. You're talking about a couple hundred families, right? The Nez Perces, the vast majority of Nez Perce people had already converted to Christianity, did not go on the warpath. The families that did, if you think it's like, it sort of wax and wane the numbers, but if you think 900 people, 2/3 of them were women, children, people too old to fight. And so we're talking about, you know, a few hundred men of fighting capacity. And there are histories of the Nez Perce War that sort of suggest that they were naive about U.S. territory and sovereignty, that when they crossed the Bitterroot Mountains and left Nez Perce country and Idaho territory and wound up in Montana, that there was kind of optimism that the war was done. But there were Nez Perce men who had fought as scouts in Montana territory, you know, with the U.S. Army, who then joined Joseph and said, you know, people were saying, this is, you know, you're not going to be left alone, right? And everywhere they went, you know, they knew, you know, the war was going to be disaster. Joseph, up until the last possible moment, tried to avoid war, and you know, they had to cross with their herds, you know, cross the rivers at flood stage, but they actually made it to the reservation boundary by the deadline. And right at that moment, there were 3 young Nez Perce men who went on a revenge killing spree along the Salmon River, and then that brought the army down on them. And I guess, you know, what wound up happening was the Nez Perces routed the army, and so it was war, right? And so from the beginning, he wasn't, you know, when the first settlers came in, I mean, they were basically living in lean-tos and they were scattered apart. They were just sitting ducks. They could have been killed. But from the very beginning, Joseph knew that he couldn't do that, right? So he was always on a peace footing. And I think some of what explains some of the Nez Perce conduct during the war is that there was a sense, you know, they were consistently beating or fighting to a stalemate the army. And a certain sense that maybe they could preserve their wealth and kind of re-enter negotiations, you know, from a position of strength. So even during war. And then you would think that war would be the end of the story, right? They lost a war, you lose your land. But Joseph actually picked up right where he left off and continued to argue that title to his land wasn't properly extinguished. And all through his life, he never quite won, but he never lost. Yeah. They kept reopening the case. They kept prompting these administrative reviews and opinions saying, Joseph's right, we didn't do anything. And, you know, up until the very end. So Joseph was really a civil actor. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't the war chief. Actually, you know, the fact that he was kind of lionized as, you know, the Red Napoleon, you know, the Indian Hannibal, that was wrong. He wasn't the war chief. There were other warriors who had much more of a leadership role in the war itself. But he was always sort of this more of a regulatory actor.
Right.
Okay, I wanted to come back to this. Christiane had kind of spoken about whether it was it a betrayal of his values when he was going after the Nez Perce, after having been sort of having taken this position with respect to abolition and slavery and all these things. So I'm always really intrigued by how race is constructed in the U.S., and I don't think I have a completely good understanding of it. Because I know you've got, and tell me if I'm wrong, you're the expert, I don't know, but you know, there's sort of a special status for African Americans, Latino, from what I understand, in terms of constructions around race. And is this, it's very difficult for me to wrap my head around it, except that I always think about dispossession. Like the U.S. Mexican, you know, the dispossession of territory from from Latino people and indigenous people in the southern United States, and the fact that African Americans were dispossessed from their land and brought as slaves, etc. Because you seem to have, like, the rest of the minorities, the rest of racialized minorities in the U.S. sort of don't have that kind of, there isn't the same kind of construct around race.
I think there's so much reasoning by analogy that I feel like with so many different groups, including, there's always this, process of, are they like African Americans, or are they like Native Americans? Are they not like? And you can see it with categories like disability.
Yes,
you see it.
So in terms of how, like, how did Howard view? How did he get to this? Like, what, do you have any insight into what actually? How did he understand? Like, did he understand the Nez Perce as a political? Like, you were talking about this distinction between a political group versus a racialized group, and is that the key distinction that sort of, led to his difference in approach, or was it something more insidious, like, where he was feeling like, here are all these African Americans who need my help and they want to be full citizens, and I want to make them full citizens. It's part of my state building project. And then there's all these resistant people who are irritating the crap out of me, and I don't care about their race, but they need to become citizens as well in the way that we say they need to be citizens. So, I'm just, because this is your continuity issue.
Right before, there had been administrative settlements of the Nez Perce question, the Wallowa Valley question, before Howard had really entered the scene. And after he met Joseph in 1875, sort of into 1876, one of his officers sort of wrote him from the field, and then he sent one of his aides, who happened to be a trained lawyer, to write reports on the land question, and he sort of inserted himself into a process that had been really Department of Interior civilian oriented, and he succeeded in getting the Wallowa Valley question reopened. And when he did that, he did it in a way that yielded him some of the best press he had gotten in years, where this is summer of 1876, Custer's last stand had just happened. It was Custer's last stand just in time for the centennial celebration of the United States. And in the wake of Custer's last stand, in some ways, there's a really interesting lack of sentimentality among Army folk after a big massacre like this. So, a lot of people were, mourning the soldiers, and then there were a lot of officers saying, "Oh, there are openings in the cavalry," and Howard. He took that as an opportunity to make a pitch for reopening the Wallowa Valley question. The way he did it was, he said, the next big Indian war is going to be in the Wallowa Valley. I am the one who can stop it, because he had experience doing different kinds of negotiations. Even before he was sent out to the Northwest, he was sent as a special delegate to negotiate peace with the Chiricahua Apache chief Cochise, and he succeeded. And so he said, I have success in negotiating our way out of this. We can settle it peacefully. And then he said, and it would save us tens of millions of dollars that we would otherwise spend in a ruinous war. And it went to all of these pieces of unfinished business from Reconstruction, including like the allegations of financial impropriety that dogged him through Reconstruction. And he succeeded in reopening it. He was placed on a new treaty or new peace commission to go out to Nez Perce country and negotiate the final status of the Wallowa Valley. And there's this amazing transcript where this commission meets with Joseph and with some other leaders. And they say, good news, we're going to pay you a lot of money for the Wallowa Valley. And Joseph says, what makes you think I need money? Right? And he absolutely refuses to negotiate. And there are ways that, after years of negotiating, there are ways you see Joseph fail as a negotiator at this moment. And then there are ways you see him kind of regroup where he essentially says, what makes you think you're the last authority on this? Right? And, he pushes and pushes, but Howard reacts very negatively. And it was as if, I think this was an occasion where his redemption was at hand and Joseph stood in the way. And
I think it was about this racial kind of, how dare you resist?
So there's something to do with that. And part of it had to do with the fact that Joseph and the other so-called non-treaty bands, really they were 1855 treaty bands as opposed to 1863 treaty bands, they weren't Christian. Instead, they believed in, they followed these sort of dreamer prophet cults that sort of proliferated in the Columbia Plateau, around this time. And there's a lot of writing by U.S. officials about the threat posed by dreamers. And I think it's less specifically about the beliefs. I mean, they do take offense that the dreamers envisioned a world without white people, but we're talking about like a couple thousand people spread over the Pacific Northwest, really big region. And so, it's much more about the end of their world as opposed to envisioning this new world. And it's more about, hope in the face of despair as opposed to something subversive. And I think what really bothers the Indian agents and other people sort of enforcing Grant's peace policy, the reservation policy, is that as long as there were people who were living traditional lives, as long as there were people who were hunting, going on seasonal hunts, right? As long as there were people who were herding in traditional ways, that was so much better than farming 20 acres in Idaho, north central Idaho. And it made, as long as there were any of these dreamers, it made it really hard, or at least in the perception of the administrators, made it impossible for anyone to sort of buy into the program of assimilation. And so there is this objection to Joseph on that ground, but I feel like a lot of that is really instrumental, and that, for Howard, the way he reacts in this transcript is really chilling, right? He would say things, at the very end, he said to Joseph, if this is your view of things, then you can't complain if evil happens to you. And it's cold. And Howard was not or at least had styled himself not as a cold man. He viewed himself as a man of sentiment. He wrote poems. He expressed his sympathy for all kinds of people. I think he was a crier. He was constantly praying, and that coldness there, when that comes through, you see a lot of things at work, and it's policy related. It's there's some substantive belief related, but so much of that is conflated with the cause of his life